Does eating too much protein actually damage your kidneys? Is red meat unfairly being blamed for things like climate change and chronic disease? Are plant-based meat alternatives healthy and nutritious, or just marketing hype? Hi, I'm Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, and today on the podcast, we are tackling the most controversial and trending topics about protein head-on. Now, you might be thinking, haven't we covered this before? Not exactly. While we've talked a lot about the importance of dietary protein, this episode is going to be quite different. Here's why. In this episode, we will be covering brand new, groundbreaking research and major developments in 2025 that are shaking up the conversation around protein, nutrition, and public health. Joining me is Dr. Donald Layman, a world-renowned protein expert and my personal mentor. Together, we'll uncover the latest science, bust myths, and dive into how anti-meat narratives might be leading us away from optimal nutrition. This episode will help you feel super prepared for the year ahead. Let's dive in. Dr. Donald Layman, welcome to the show.
It's great to be back.
You are the most frequent guest on this podcast, and today is unlike any other day because we're probably going to offend just about everyone. We decided to wake up and choose violence with our discussion on protein. How do you feel about that?
No, it's a no-nonsense day, right? Let's go.
It's a no-nonsense day. For those of you who don't know Dr. Donald Layman, he has been my best friend and mentor for over 20 years now. I'm looking pretty good for 25. We met when I was just 5 years old. But all jokes aside, you are one of the world-leading experts in protein metabolism, and you have contributed to the world substantially. And I am so grateful to have you here to share your knowledge. And quite frankly, part of my work is to share your knowledge. So thank you so much.
It's been fun. I love what I do. People ask me about retiring from the university, and it's still my hobby. So, I love doing it.
Well, you are world class at that. And to kick off our first question and just really our first discussion, protein now in this age of data, awareness, it seems that the status of the American diet is in a pretty poor place. And I'm curious as to how you begin to think about where we're at from a nutritional standpoint.
I think I always start with, where we're at. We're eating too many calories, and the calories we're eating aren't very healthy. They're very low in nutrient density. We're eating way too many grains. 65% of Americans are eating more grains in total, breads, cereals, rice, pasta, than they need. And 95% are eating too many refined grains. And frankly, we're eating too many foods that have low nutrient density. And about 45% of people in the U.S. are eating below their protein needs. So we've just got a really poor balance of the foods we're selecting.
I think that's a very interesting statement. We were looking at some of the dietary guidelines, the intakes compared to the recommendations. And oftentimes we hear that we're eating too much protein. But according to that graph, 45% of individuals eating American diet are below the RDA. Is that
right?
Correct?
And so you can find individuals who are eating above the requirement. You can find guys in particular who may be eating a lot of protein, but as you just said, 45% are considered eating below it. And then you really have to start looking at those groups. Older women over the age of 60 are particularly low. Young women are particularly low. And so you start having to really individualize how you think about protein.
And you'd mentioned grains versus refined grains. Can you talk a little bit about that and how do we think about that in the overall health landscape?
I think it's important to recognize that grains are a cheap form of calories, and the food industry loves to sell them. So you can go out and buy a bushel of wheat for $6, and you can make it into 45 boxes of a wheat cereal that you sell for $4 each. So that's something over a 30-fold profit. So there should be no doubt in anyone's mind that the food industry wants to sell you grains. And what we hear is that, well, people aren't eating enough whole grains, and that's a fiber statement. But the reality is most people are eating too many grains in general, and certainly too many refined grains. So I think if there's any one change I would make in the American diet, I'd cut the grains in half to begin with.
I was looking at the foods consumed. The number one food consumed in America, do you know what it is?
I'd probably go with bread.
Pizza.
Pizza, sure. Bread,
Pizza.
bread crust.
Yes.
Yeah.
The most consumed vegetable. This is like, I feel like.
And it's the primary source of saturated fat in the American diet.
Is pizza.
Is pizza.
Do you know, quiz time, do you know the number one vegetable?
Potatoes.
That's right. You eat French fries.
French fries, yeah.
And what about fruit?
In fact, I think the average intake of vegetables in the U.S. is something like 2.6 servings per day. It should be something over 5, and 1.7 of those are French fries. So basically, people are eating no other vegetables other than potatoes.
I mean, that is very impressive. The skepticism.
And I think that's one of the things to keep in mind. When people say we need a more plant-based diet, my comment is we don't need a more plant-based diet. We need a diet with better plants. The plants we're eating are awful.
And in these recommendations, and really this is coming from the dietary guidelines, these recommendations, I believe from what I read, less than 50% of people even follow those. Have you seen the data for the individuals who actually follow the guidelines? And piggybacking off of that, what is the purpose of these dietary guidelines? How do we inform Americans how to eat?
Yeah. So within the dietary guidelines, they sort of track how Americans are doing by what they call the Healthy Eating Index. And that varies by age group. But in general, it's around 58%. Americans are at about a 58% score on the Healthy Index, meaning 58% following of the dietary guidelines. Purpose of them has evolved over the years, but it's basically to try to define a baseline healthy diet and a diet to keep people from becoming ill. They've slowly gotten more focused on issues of obesity and diabetes and heart disease. Initially, it was just simply, what defines a healthy diet.
How long have you been studying nutrition?
I started studying nutrition really in about 1972.
What was it like then in terms of...
You mean before electricity or things like that?
So I wasn't going to say it, but yeah. What was it like back then in terms of what people were concerned about? Were they concerned about the fortification of food? You had touched on nutrient density, and perhaps the solution for individuals eating cheap sources of food was to then fortify it. But was the landscape different of what the focus was from a nutritional standpoint in 1970?
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things about nutrition is it's a relatively young science. Most of it really happened starting after World War II. So when I got into nutrition, I actually learned a lot of my nutrition from the first generation of people who discovered vitamin D and the essential amino acids. And, so I learned from those people. So we were still at the point of really discovering nutrients in the early 70s. But what really was changing the landscape at that point was the fat issue started to show up. So I went to Minnesota for my PhD, and that's where Ansel Keys was. And we got the original 7-country studies and the anti-fat, anti-saturated fat, even the anti-cholesterol thinking. So I was there. I actually published a study with Ivan Franz, who was one of the lead authors on the Minnesota Heart Study. So, I sort of grew up in that environment, one, thinking about protein and growth and malnutrition. I did some work in Africa with malnourished children, so I kind of understood the muscle-centric concept of health, but I also was around that issue of fat and cholesterol. And so I graduated with my PhD thinking cholesterol really and saturated fat really were bad. And I started doing research on it and realized that's really all a myth.
Was there a moment where, it's very difficult as a young professor to challenge the status quo because academia is not friendly to that. One would think that it would be, but it is definitely not. How did you navigate that? And did you have an insight, and perhaps that it wasn't what the repetition was, what the individuals were continuously repeating?
Yeah, I guess I've always been an individual to question why. Does it really make sense? As you know, I'm very mechanistic oriented. Can I put it into a framework? I just had some early indications that, things weren't always as cut and dried as they were appeared. One of the examples that always come to mind is when I was doing my graduate work at Minnesota, there was an individual by the name of Fred Kumerlo, who happened to be at the University of Illinois at that time, and he really discovered the issue of trans fats. And he came and gave a seminar, and Ivan France and Goldberg were there, and basically they literally ridiculed him about trans fats. They said it absolutely couldn't be an issue, that, ultra heating of seed oils couldn't possibly be dangerous. And they ridiculed him. And I was actually embarrassed as a student thinking that that's the way academics acted. And, 10 years later, they were banned from the food supply. We realized they're the most toxic thing that could be in our food, the trans fats. So that made me really start questioning some of the realities. And, I did a study with Ivan France and Penny Chris Etherton about cholesterol. And what we noticed was that early exposure to cholesterol basically made animals immune to it, whether you had it later or not. So, it made me question some of the things about infant feeding and cholesterol. It just sort of evolved. I started doing studies on malnutrition and things like that and body composition. I just realized a lot of the stories that were out there simply weren't true. And plus I had some advisors who kind of taught me to question everything. When I went in and talked with my advisor, Pat Swan, the first thing she would always say is, prove it.
I see that hasn't been lost on you. Needless to say, I've spent countless hours proving it to you. You had said that you were embarrassed as a student was it for the professor that was presenting the information on trans fats? And then were you embarrassed at the way that they treated him, or what was can you just expand on that?
All of that above. I think one of the things that we have lost, and I think we were beginning to lose it that way at that time, was the concept of scholarly exchange, of dialogue. And what I saw was a person presenting a very interesting concept that was important to study, and people who simply didn't want to consider the fact that their seed oils that they were trying to sell might be dangerous. And I just found that embarrassing, that it wasn't a scholarly discussion, something that as a student I should be exposed to, we should all think about. And I think that's very prevalent now, that people are so in love with their own theories, and they're so invested in their careers in proving a theory. When it's wrong, that's pretty hard to deal with. And so their approach to it is really obscuring the truth or retaliation against the people telling the different story.
And that somewhat goes against the whole concept of intellectual conversation and science. And I will say it becomes very difficult to engage those individuals that are on the defense, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I mean, it turns to be emotional when it should be intellectual. I think you and I have lots of exchanges, and, we don't always agree on every topic, but we do it intellectually, and I think that's what's missing. And I grew up with advisors who allowed you to question things, and actually challenged you to question things. And we've lost that. We've become more and more siloed in our opinion, and anybody who doesn't agree gets rejected. I mean, it happened to me just in the last 2 weeks, a paper we've sent in. One of the reviewers was heavily invested in doing some similar work, and frankly admitted out loud that our paper was being rejected because they were doing similar work. I mean, that's simply unethical.
And that kind of behavior seems to have created a lot of public discourse. The outcome of highly intellectual individuals who are trying to solve problems, for example, with seed oils and trans fats and partially hydrogenated fats, seems to have created a very polarizing topic. Would you say that that's fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we have people who have invested their entire careers in one point of view, probably heavily funded by companies that make money by selling those things, and they're simply not open to any discussion about it. And unfortunately, the dietary guidelines reflect some of that.
When the first dietary guideline was when? Was it 1980?
1980 was the first Surgeon General report, and the first true dietary guidelines by committee were 1985.
And you had how far into your practice or your scholarlyship, if that's even a word, were you when that first came out?
So I went to the University of Illinois as a professor in 1977. So 85, I'd been there for 7-8 years or so. 80, 3 years. So it was pretty early in my career. And again, I was still kind of at the point of, okay, this makes sense. I'll buy this.
But when you say you'll buy this, you mean that saturated fat was bad? Or...
Yeah, that, eat a variety of foods, eat more plants, vegetables, you need fiber. But, the lower salt, cholesterol was bad. Saturated fat needed to be restricted. I sort of bought into those things.
How much of that has evolved in terms of your thinking?
My thinking?
Yes.
A lot. In terms of dietary guidelines, very little. I spent 4 years as director of research for the American Egg Board after I left the University of Illinois. So I got a firsthand look at the cholesterol aspects. We funded a lot of research from, I think in 1984, the president of the American Heart Association came out and said if we could get the intake of cholesterol in the American public from about 650 milligrams down below 300 milligrams per day, quote, we would eradicate heart disease by the year 2000. In the year 2000, we had just as much heart disease. The dietary intake of cholesterol had fallen to 285, and we still had the same problems. So it turned out to be a total lie. And so we funded a lot of that research, and we realized that dietary cholesterol has almost zero impact on blood cholesterol. And so that was kind of the first real straw breaking the camel's back there. And since then, I've spent more and more time thinking about the saturated fat part, and I think it's equally false.
At the time when Ancel Keys came out with the 7-country study, did anyone question him?
There was a lot of pushback at the beginning, but I never met him. He was viewed as a very strong, vocal, and political individual, and he sort of pushed that. But the biochemists at the time, Phil White and Handler and Broquist and Olson, they all said that the saturated fat argument wasn't true, that having 45% fat in the diet was perfectly healthy. And so there was a lot of pushback, but between Ancel Keys and then Mark Hegstead at the USDA, they basically convinced the powers to be to come out with those guidelines. So it really was a very slanted opinion and politically based at the beginning.
Tell me a little bit about who Mark Hegstead was or is.
Mark Hegstead, I met him a couple of times. He was a friend of one of my professors, Lavelle Henderson, so I had dinner with him a few times. Mark Hegstead was a professor, I believe, at Harvard, and he was very much in the category of thought saturated fat, and fat was the root of all evil. Obesity, diabetes, everything was based on eating too many fats. And so, that was his perspective, and that's kind of what he brought to the guidelines.
At the time, do you know what the saturated percent in the diet was?
I think at that time, and frankly, it hasn't changed much. It's always been kind of the upper 30s, sort of 36 to 38, and that's kind of where it was in terms of a population average.
Mm-hmm.
And it really is still about there.
Yes, and the average percentage, I know we don't like percent, but I think it's 11% of the diet now, saturated fat.
Yeah, I think, and that has been pretty much consistent since World War II. It really hasn't changed. Even though we've had a 40% decline in red meat consumption, we've just traded it out, as you said, with pizza and also with hydrogenated seed oils. So, the fats really haven't changed much. Your comment about I don't like percentages related to protein. Once you define your protein amount, you can make the others percentages if you want. It's kind of irrelevant, but you can't start with the idea that 30% fat is an important percentage. Again, my background, where did that 30% come from? Well, there was the Ansel Keys group and Ornation people who were arguing fat below 20% of the diet. And there was the people like the biochemists, Broquist and Handler and White, and those guys who were saying 40 plus is perfectly fine. And they couldn't come to any agreement. They both had their science to back it. And so they said, how about a compromise at 30? So 30 was a number, just purely a compromise in a committee that was pulled out of thin air. And there was never a single piece of data to back that up.
At this point, everyone should be taking omega-3 fatty acids. And I'm so grateful for Peori for sponsoring this episode. Omega-3 fatty acids have positive effects on the heart, the brain, muscle health, and overall inflammation. There is increasing evidence that EPA and DHA may also help with brain function and mood, all of which are critical for our well-being. Now, I won't take just any omega-3 supplement. I only want the best. And frankly, there's so many toxins and heavy metals involved with our fish production. That's why I choose Peori O3 omega-3 fish oil. It is third-party tested. It's certified by the Clean Label Project. And this is the only source of omega-3 fatty acids that I trust and highly recommend. I trust it so much that I open up a little capsule, mix it with my kids' milk because omega-3 fatty acids are important for their brain development. Every batch of Peori O3 Ultra Pure fish oil and all of their supplements are tested against more than 200 contaminants with all of their results published online. So I can have peace of mind, and so can you. Support your health. Add Peori O3 Ultra Pure fish oil to your routine, just like I did. I've worked with Peori on this amazing deal for you and my friends. You get 20% off the entire site. That applies to already discounted subscriptions. You'll get almost a third off the price. But to get this offer, you must go to my exclusive URL, Peori, which is PUORI.com/Dr. Lyon, and use the promo code Dr. Lyon. Don't wait. Let's get started. I want to let that land because we have spent since the 70s, well, actually 80s, I suppose, when the first guidelines came out, defining that the diet should be 30% fat. And what Don is saying, someone who was there, because you're more mature in numbers, was there. And firsthand that there was no data to support that. It seemed as if it was a compromise. We've had now decades upon decades of recommendations and guidelines and information filtered out to the public, to medical providers, disseminating this number. And we are fatter than we've ever been. By the time we hit 20, 30, 50% of Americans are projected to be obese. Not overweight, obese.
Yeah. We're already at 75% are overweight. So, it's a massive problem. And there's still no data to prove that 30% is a meaningful number. Is 38 too high? We're eating too many calories. But as I said before, 95% of people are eating too many refined carbs, too many refined grains. So, is the high carbohydrate diet, are those calories somehow better or worse than the high fat component? We're getting far more calories from carbs than we are from fat.
And this set the stage for, part of the conversation and the reason why I want to talk about protein in this age of data awareness is that we're now coming up to the 2025 dietary guidelines, which when we look at the evolution, I'm not so sure it's evolved that much. And if you continue to have 30% fat and then 10% saturated fat, we now, because of those numbers, seem to reduce the appeal, according to these guidelines, of animal-based products. And primarily what I care about, partially because of you, is dietary protein.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that we can track the epidemics of obesity and diabetes back to those 1980s and basically the appearance of the dietary guidelines. Basically, exactly with those dietary guidelines in 1985 is when the curve changed. And so then we need to start looking at what changed in the food supply. As I mentioned earlier, we've decreased our beef consumption by 40%.
Do we know why that's decreased?
I assume that, I think there's two parts. I think one is the anti-beef, the anti-red meat has sunk in with some people. So there's definitely, 45% are under the protein requirement. I think they're eating less meats. And there was a 35% decrease in milk consumption and a 33% decrease in egg consumption. It was largely replaced by processed chicken. A lot of ultra-processed chicken forms, reconstituted nuggets and fingers and all kinds of that kind of thing. And there was a dramatic increase in carbohydrates in the diet. So we had with the decrease in the animal proteins, get back to your protein question, we had a net increase of 350 to 400 calories. And so my initial comment is nutrient density. We have diluted the nutrient density of the American diet by switching out the high nutrient dense animal products for low nutrient dense carbohydrate grains and seed oils.
What about, and seed oils are a really hot topic, the seed oil introduction to the American diet, do you know when that was?
I mean, they've been around since the early 1900s in small forms. I think one of the things to keep in mind was Crisco was introduced in 1911, I believe.
I used to eat Crisco in brown brownies.
Yeah. I mean, we were taught, and if you think about an ultra-processed food, there's probably nothing more synthetic than a product like that. It has no reality in natural products. And so, we've seen a dramatic, since that 1930 range, the seed oils that are in our food, added to our food, have gone from around 30 pounds per capita per year up to around 80. So that's a 50-pound per capita increase, while the animal fats, butter and lard, tallow, have gone down from about a little under 20 pounds down to less than 5. 15 per year, pounds per year, per capita. So that's for every, man, woman, and child in the U.S. So obviously that's not uniform, but it gives you some idea of how the fat has changed. So if you just add those two up, there's been a 15-pound per person decrease in the animal fats with a 50-pound replacement by seed oils. People ask me, what do I think about seed oils? And the bottom line is we're just eating vastly too many of them. We're eating way too many calories. There may be some safety issues, but the bottom line is the processed foods are giving us too many calories.
When people say, are seed oils bad for you? And obviously there's various types of seed oils, whether it's canola or you name it, corn,
soy,
whatever.
flour,
Yeah.
all of them.
Sesame oil, which, by the way, I think tastes great. You hear that people will say, I mean, globally, that it's bad for you. But the data, again, I've had Kevin Mackey on here. The polyunsaturated fats, when you replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, it seems like it has some effect on LDL. But again, I would love for you to comment if the addition of seed oils, potentially, I don't want to sound conspiracy theorist, with the focus of decreasing saturated fat was intentional to make animal products, quote, unhealthy.
Yes. There's a lot of things to unwrap there. Okay, so let's start with the polyunsaturated story and the saturated fat. I think that the data is really clear that when you add polyunsaturated fats to replace saturated, you will get a decrease in LDL. I think that's pretty clear. The relationship of that decrease in LDL to health is very unclear. It really depends on where you're starting from, what your values are. So that's has to be really thought about. We can unwrap that more. The issue of the polyunsaturated and saturate then is the effect adding the poly or removing the saturate? And that's another thing that isn't clear. I think there's a growing belief that it's adding the polyunsaturates is actually having the effect. And so then you ask how much, and there's a lot of belief that we're eating way too many polyunsaturates. The polyunsaturates are highly inflammatory, and we've dramatically increased those in the diet. So people now are looking at things like the omega-3 to the long-chain fatty acid ratios.
Would that be omega-6 and 9?
And the omega-6 to the omega-3 ratios. And most people are concluding we're way too high on the omega-6s from an inflammatory standpoint. So, I think that there's a lot of sort of conclusions out there that sound like they're really strongly based, that are very weak science. And frankly, I think a lot of the questions are simply being ignored. Does LDL really have any relationship to mortality? Doesn't appear to. Does it have any relationship to cardiovascular events? Well, most of the studies that back that are statin-based studies that show that lowering LDL will have a reduction in myocardial events. But then it says, well, it's the drug effect. It's not a diet effect. And statins have a lot of effects other than just lowering cholesterol. And so is it really an anti-inflammatory effect of statins? So again, the data is extrapolated to, by individuals to imply that animal fats are bad, when in fact, that's not really what the data is telling us.
And with the new dietary guidelines coming out, there's also that new label of what can be defined as healthy. Do you care to mention that?
So I haven't really seen that. That's a new ruling by the FDA of qualifying foods. So that's separate from the dietary guidelines. And they've come out and said that eggs and salmon, for example, can now be qualified as healthy foods.
Eggs as well?
Yes.
Even though they're 18% saturated fat?
Exactly. So now what we have is we have red meat with 13% saturated fat to 15%, while is not considered healthy, where eggs with 18 and salmon with 20% saturated fat are considered healthy. So now you have to really back up and say, how can you justify that? And so now you get into politics, and you also get into something like, well, we're going to say salmon has a lot of omega-3s in it, so we're going to ignore the fact that it has a lot of saturated fat. So now we're picking and choosing when we decide to make it healthy. I think that's not justifiable. I think salmon and eggs are healthy foods, but I think red meat is too.
Even though there has been somewhat of a defamation of meat. And we talk about, I would say that this podcast, we really highlight nutrition, and we do so because it's a foundation. It's something that everybody has to do. We all have to eat. The narrative and the top-down approach from physicians, from health experts, it's just, I think it hasn't been thought about enough and heard from experts like yourself. So there is, everywhere you look, there is some reiteration of a study saying red meat is bad for you. And it just seems to become this universal scapegoat. And the reason I spend so much time talking about meat is because I would argue that from nutrient density, from women of childbearing age with anemia, from growing children, it's just such an essential staple for a healthy diet. Could you be healthy without it? Totally. But there's a lot of defamation of meat, and I'm just curious if it's rooted in science or it's ideological.
I think it actually begins ideological, and then people go to great lengths to try and find enough science to back it up. I think that there are people, including Ansel Keys and others, who have a belief about certain kinds of diets, a Mediterranean diet, about more seafood, less red meat, or things like that. And they basically went out to find data to back it up. I think a lot of the epidemiology that comes out of Harvard is really based on personal bias that they then go to look for data to back it up. So, I think it is really ideologically based. And then I think you complicate that more with profit margin. The food industry makes a lot more money selling cheap grains and seed oils than it does selling animal products. Animal products have very little processing. Milk goes pretty much directly from the farm to the grocery store. Eggs go from the farm to the grocery store. Meat has to be prepped, but basically it goes pretty much, there's a little processing, and it requires refrigeration, and it has spoilage. So it's a very low profit margin in every part of the food industry, where again, grains are the highest profit. And so you can see that. And you can go to the pharmaceutical industry and you say, what's the profit margin? Well, statins are one of the most sold drugs in the United States. 90 million people are taking statins now.
90 million?
90 million.
It's up from 40. Goodness.
And so I think I have that number right. But anyway, came in 1990. They didn't exist, and now we have some, millions of people taking them. It's a very profitable drug. But if you don't have the cholesterol and saturated fat story, why would anybody take them?
If you don't have the cholesterol and fat story, then there would be no reason to lower, are you saying cholesterol, HDL, LDL-C?
I mean, if we decide that dietary cholesterol and dietary saturated fat aren't important, then the argument for how you should change your life and take statins becomes very weak. We know that the whole LDL story becomes weaker. Is an LDL above 200 a health risk? For sure. But is an LDL of 100 healthier? That's an extrapolation that's not based in science.
Mm. When we think about feeding a nation or even globally, do you think that there is going to be a place for protein alternatives?
I think the question about population, about protein production, I think protein is the most expensive thing and hardest thing to produce. So I think it's something we always have to be conscious of. So I think that is always going to be a limiting factor.
Is it just because of animals, the animal processing, or just?
It's just protein is the hardest thing to produce. Carbohydrates are the cheapest thing to produce, and protein's the most difficult. Animals are the most concentrated source, and it's all about essential amino acids. Where do essential amino acids come from? This is a quiz. This is yours.
Yeah. Animal source food. Did I get it right?
The only place in life where we get essential amino acids is bacteria. And the bacteria are either on the roots of plants, so we can make essential amino acids that way. That's why you fertilize your vegetable garden with nitrogen.
Wait, say that again. The only place essential amino acids come from is from bacteria?
Yep. Other than making them in a laboratory, the only place in nature they come from is bacteria. And so plants are the origins of those. We take it from the soil as nitrogen, and we can form it into organic amines, and the plant will make it into amino acids. But the plant makes it into non-essential amino acids predominantly. It's about somewhere between 25 and 40% of the amino acids it makes are non-essential because it's making roots and leaves and blossoms and seeds. What humans have evolved to do is use animals to translate those plant calories into more dense protein calories. And ruminant animals are particularly important because they have bacteria in their stomach, in the ruminant stomach, and basically they take that fibrous plant material, they can break it down, capture all the nitrogen, and make the exact essential amino acid pattern that humans need. So ruminant animals are particularly unique in the world food supply because they balance the essential amino acids in ways plants really can't do for us.
That makes me think of our microbiome. Our wonderful mutual friend, Suzanne Devkota at Cedars-Sinai Microbiome Institute. Is there a world, and we talked about this many years ago, and actually we haven't discussed it since, even though we talk every day about whatever it is there a world in which our microbiome, perhaps a percentage of individuals, our microbiome looks more similar to a ruminant, and that thus some of us, maybe a very small percentage of us, can generate essential amino acids through bacteria?
I think you're referring to a Nature paper that Suzanne and I published.
I didn't know if there was a follow-up, and I don't know whatever happened with that, but that's exactly what I am referencing.
So I did a lot of work in Africa early in my career with malnutrition, things like kwashiorkor and things like that. And I really got sensitive to what you and I now call muscle-centric health. And one of the things that sort of led me to think about that over time, and as Suzanne started studying the microbiome, I always wondered why vegetarians aren't more amino acid deficient than they are. I mean, at some level, they become more deficient in protein. You get low enough and you have protein malnutrition. But I always wondered about it. And so we ran a study, and this was with animals, which is the way most of the microbiome data is being done right now. But we basically said, I wonder if the fiber in the diet could make the microbiome different. Could we, in fact, change the microbiome to be more like a ruminant animal? I mean, there's some speculation about why do we have an appendix. There were some arguments. There are some arguments early in life that was sort of like a ruminant stomach, that there were bacteria there that would help ferment foods. But anyway, so we ran that study with different levels of fiber in very malnourished, very low protein diets with animals. And what we found was that with higher fiber intakes, we would change the microbiome and we would get some of the bugs that would resemble what's in the ruminant stomach. And those individual bugs actually would make some of the essential amino acids, methionine, threonine in particular. I think phenylalanine also. So there were lines of bugs that would make some of those. And what we found was that the animals with the high fiber diet, even with the same protein intake, would be less deficient than the ones with the low fiber intake. So that kind of, again, that was published in Nature. It was a very speculative, theoretical kind of paper, but it suggested why some vegetarians might not be as deficient as we would expect them to be.
It's very fascinating, the landscape of microbiome, because there is this push, and rightly so, towards individual personalized nutrition.
Yeah.
You and I were talking upstairs earlier about how do we determine if we believe that protein should not be looked at as a percentage of calories, and protein should be looked at as individual nutrients, probably primarily the essential amino acids, would you say? Or would you say that all of the amino acids should be looked at as individual nutrients?
Certainly, the essential need to be weighted more, but I think they all need, I don't think we know enough about the roles of individual amino acids. I mean, some people believe that arginine, which is considered non-essential, is in fact essential. I think one of the things that for me, protein is simply a food delivery system. It's like saying I'm going to take a vitamin pill per day. I don't really care the color of the pill. I care about the 14 vitamins inside of it. I don't really care about protein per se. I care about the 9 essential amino acids inside of it. And so I think people need to understand that we have a need for essential amino acids and then what we call non-essential amino acids or non-specific nitrogen is the way I learned it. And so those are the two parts. And I think that as we talk about nutrient density in the diet, we need to think about amino acids as nutrients and not as just some subdivision of protein.
This episode is brought to you by the best of the best, my favorite home items, hands down, Cozy Earth. I cannot get enough of their sheets, towels, and PJs. Please feel free to send me a pair. Cozy Earth makes the softest bamboo sheet set made from 100% premium viscose from bamboo. Their breathable, temperature-regulating sheets are uniquely soft and only get softer with every wash, which, by the way, is great because my kids are really into using the washing machine these days. I know the time is limited with my little ones, and there will come a time where they don't want to crawl into bed with us anymore. But while they do, I want them to be in the coziest, softest sheets ever, and these sheets are the best and durable with a 10-year guarantee. A better year starts with better sleep. Wrap yourself in Cozy Earth. Don't wait. Head to cozyearth.com/Dr. Lyon now and use my exclusive code Dr. Lyon for up to 40% off. That's cozyearth.com/Dr. Lyon. And if you get a post-purchase survey, say you heard about Cozy Earth from the Dr. Gabrielle Lyon Show podcast. Right. And I agree with you. And that's kind of where I'm going with this conversation, because we have this now evolving, hopefully, dietary guidelines, and we're trying to provide recommendations to feed a nation and ultimately a world. And when we get a recommendation for protein, let's say that my need for not just protein, but let's say your need for leucine is going to be different than my need for leucine, or threonine. Your need for threonine is going to be different than mine. Is there a world where we can determine, again, this is the ultimate in personalized nutrition. If we really think about these as individual nutrients, for example, you need 10 grams of leucine and 5 grams of threonine based on whatever your health status is. Do you think that there's a world where we will eventually be able to identify and get there for humans?
That's certainly one of my career objectives. I think we're far from that. And as you know, in the last 2 years, I've published 2 different papers sort of highlighting the importance of shifting toward recognizing the essential amino acids as nutrients. So right now, there really is no funding related to that. Nobody's doing that kind of research. Researchers aren't focused on it. There's a few individuals in Canada that are thinking more about it, but it's just not getting done. And a story, back in the late 80s, I pretty well knew that leucine was going to be an important role in protein synthesis. And I sent in grants to NIH, National Institute of Health, for a decade. And the reviews, I always got rejected. The reviews came back was basically there was no reason to study protein. There's no protein problems in the American diet. And so it was rejected. I finally had to go to food industry and get money, and we proved that leucine was a key to adult health and really the fundamental amino acid defining your protein needs as an aging adult. And so that took me 15, 20 years to basically get over the hump to allow us to prove that. We started working on that in the mid-'80s, and it was really 2000 before we had fully proved that point. So I think it's going to be a really slow process, but we're trying to shed light on that. We're trying to make people conscious of it. And hopefully people will ask, what level of threonine do I need for gut health to produce mucin?
Mm-hmm.
What level of tryptophan do I need in my diet so I sleep better? What level of phenylalanine do I need so that my cognitive memory is better? I think those are all totally viable questions, and we have no idea.
Can you go into, I'm going to summarize what I believe that you've said so far, at least when it comes to, strap in, folks. Basically, we've talked about dietary needs of protein. Well, we haven't really, but we've really laid out where the roots of the dietary guidelines came from. And it really began with how do we make Americans healthy? They started with saturated fat. Nobody could agree upon it. They came up with a 30%. That 30% number of fat and 10% number of saturated fat have truly, for the last 50 plus years, 50 years, 80, almost 50 years, defined how we shape Americans' diet, their diet. And that wasn't rooted in what we would call high quality evidence, which is mind blowing. Are you with me so far?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just waiting for the correction to come in.
If you go back to the cholesterol argument at the Framingham study of people who had high cholesterol, they actually had the lowest number of heart attacks. It wasn't correct at all.
And my concern, which is why I always invite you back on the podcast. Well, number one,
it's just because you like
this
me.
is true. But also, my fear is that with all the noise in the space, that we're going to lose sight of what is true and what's not true, and where the history repeats itself.
Yeah.
And if we do not examine where we've been, then we're not going to be able to challenge where we're going, and we're not in a good place.
I mean, I think one has to just look at what's the dietary advice you're getting and what's happening with health. The longer we have this same dietary advice, the worse our health is getting. We need to do something different.
Yeah.
And there's not much evidence that the dietary guidelines are moving toward doing anything different. Well, I think the fact that they're not understanding saturated fat correctly and they're not dealing with the carbohydrates correctly basically distorts all of the other outcomes.
And also, just to tie this saturated fat, when you think about sources of saturated fat versus sources of monounsaturated fat, could you highlight that a little bit for us? Because I think that there are some very deep misconceptions.
Well, I mean, everybody thinks of saturated fat as just an animal thing. And since we've had the anti-animal issue, saturated fats from hydrogenated seed oils now makes up 35% of the saturated fat in the American diet. So we've gone from it not being zero to now 35%.
What do you mean not being zero?
I mean, it was zero. I mean, basically hydrogenated fats, first showed up with Crisco. But then those were partially hydrogenated, so we had the trans fats. So we didn't really have fully hydrogenated fats until, I think, around 1990. I don't know the exact date.
And the trans fats, they took out. They put it in.
Those are illegal in the U.S. at detectable levels. Are they still there? I think they probably are still there. The rule is they have to be less than 0.5 grams per serving. And so if you look at something like potato chips, are they actually there or not? Well, as long as the serving has less than 0.5, they're not. So they could still be there. So again, food labeling may not be telling you the whole story.
Trans fats versus hydrogenated fats. What's the difference? And when did they? Yeah, I mean, I guess.
So the fats we were talking about earlier, the polyunsaturated fats, the PUFAs, so they have more than one. So oleic acid, olive oil has a single is monounsaturated. Polyunsaturated has 2 or more, 3 on a lot of the fatty acids. And so as you begin to add hydrogens to it, you take away the saturated double bonds. That's a process known as hydrogenation. They become more saturated. You can saturate it at 1 level or 2 or 3, and so they can be they can be partially hydrogenated or they could be fully hydrogenated. When you hydrogenate a little bit, most of the fatty acid double bonds are what we call cis double bonds. They have a certain shape. And when you begin to hydrogenate, you can get some that have the opposite shape. They're trans. And so cis and trans double bonds are the issue. And that partial hydrogenation would form some of those trans bonds, which are pretty toxic.
And one of the other things, so you're talking about where saturated fat comes from in the diet. I would love for you to hit on eggs and meat and just some of the sources.
So I think we were mentioning a little earlier that if you look at saturated fat in meats, we now have a lot of very lean meats, which have only around 13% saturated fat. It's important when you think about beef fat, though, to recognize that the primary fat in beef is olive oil. It's oleic acid.
Say that.
It's 51% olive oil. The rest of it has a mixture of fatty acids. Saturated fat makes up around 35. Saturated fat makes up around 13 to 18%, depending on the cut of meat. Eggs are around 18%. Eggs for years could not be considered a healthy food because it had 18% saturated fat. But if you actually look at an egg, it only has about 1.6 grams, which is very little. That's one of my problems with this 10% saturated fat concept, is that it's used to degrade foods. If you think about 10% saturated fat, say a person, generally they use the model of 2,000 calorie diet. So 10% would be 22 and a half grams of saturated fat are okay. So an egg with 1.6 is irrelevant. I mean, you can't possibly eat enough eggs to get to 22 grams of saturated fat. And so I think one of the problems is that 10% is used to demonize certain foods, when in fact, if it actually is a meaningful number, it should be a diet total. And so, people ignore the fact that farm-raised salmon is above 20% saturated fat. It's one of the fattiest. It has one of the most saturated fat foods in the American food supply, but somehow we consider that okay.
Farm-raised salmon has one of the highest saturated
saturated fat
contents, and we consider that okay.
And we do it because it has omega-3s in it. But beef has EPA and DHA in it, not as high a levels, but they're there, and they're highly bioavailable, but we don't consider that.
If we were to think about the audience members, and we have a lot of women that listen to the show, and you did some of the first postmenopausal and perimenopausal studies, or is it postmenopausal women?
We didn't do a lot of that, but one of our thoughts with some of our first weight loss studies were that we know that estrogen's changing and menopause, and we know that fat distribution will change in women. They tend to deposit fat stores in different ways post-menopause. So we thought that, and that's an insulin-related issue. So we thought carbohydrates would be a big deal. So in a couple of our first studies, what we did was half of our subjects were premenopause and half of them were postmenopause. And we were looking to whether diet, low-carb, higher protein diets would have a different effect. And we didn't really find it. We didn't on weight loss or blood hormones or insulin sensitivity, triglycerides, things like leptin, ghrelin, things. We didn't find anything that really said the pre and post were different in a weight loss study.
And I think that that's really interesting because, we're talking about personalization as the key to optimal health. And the outcomes for optimal health might be different for everybody. But from my perspective as a clinician, it really is about body composition. You start there, and I believe for the most part, unless there's some genetic variant, that when you control for body composition, you control for metabolic syndrome. When you control for muscle mass, you control for activities of daily living, the strength, your ability to ambulate, all of these markers of health, and just from a metabolic sync perspective, become better. When we then think about transitions and the life cycle, women go through perimenopause. Seems like everyone's doing great. They hit perimenopause, things begin to change. And then postmenopausal women oftentimes say, I've had a redistribution, they might not use those words, a redistribution of body fat. They have central adiposity around the belly, visceral fat. And they will say, or we experience this in our clinic that we have, that doing what they used to do doesn't work. And one of the things that we really coach women on are, you can correct for hormones, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll lose weight.
Yeah.
And some of your unique work showed weight loss without hormone replacement therapy. And that's kind of what I'm getting at, is how do we give people the tools of cutting through the noise and thinking about designing a diet for themselves?
So what, as a woman gets to that premenopause stage and begins to go through it, and they know their bodies are changing, what do you think they do with their diet? What do you think their solutions are? Because I think this is really critical to what those outcomes are.
Well, I think from experience that, and again, I'm just
you
saying
work
this,
with these people, so I have my opinions about it from clinical studies, but you actually are a physician working with them.
Well, I would say in our clinic, one of the things that happens is women definitely feel very fatigued, and so their training capacity changes, and maybe it's a decrease in testosterone, perhaps it's a dysregulation of sleep, and they might drink some wine before bed to get to sleep. They might do calorie restriction. They will try all kinds of ways. That's what I've seen.
I think you're right on all of that, but I think there's a fundamental thing that they are doing even more so, and that is they're selecting out their animal proteins because they think there's a lot of fat and calories in them, and they're selecting carbs instead. I think there's a real shift that direction.
Why?
Because it's very comforting, and they believe those animal proteins are somehow bad for them, and they inherently like the carbs. I think there's a fundamental shift there. And I think that when you look at the NHANES data and you find that of women over 60, over 40% are below the RDA for protein, I think that fundamentally supports it.
That's an interesting statistic, and we've spoken about it. And then, but when you also look at the dietary intakes compared to the recommendation, 45% across the board seem to be lower in protein. So, I think about how come that's 45% across everybody, and then 40%. I would expect it to be higher, I guess is what I'm saying.
Oh, I see. Yeah. And I think it will be as the population continues aging, as the population shifts toward older. I mean, the other part of that is the young women, women in the 18 to 22 range are also, I think it's around 20% are below the RDA. So, if you look at that, the dietary guidelines data, what we know is that women tend to be on the side that is near or below the RDA, and men tend to be at the higher end of those numbers. It's the food choices they make.
And, from my clinical experience, when women are younger, I used to be vegan. I laugh, I say that, but I really was exploring.
I can't believe we were friends.
I know. But, after my teeth got loose and my hair started falling out, But for a period of time, I was vegan. That didn't work for me. I had a lot of nutritional deficiencies. I was anemic. Believe it or not, I had biotin deficiency. I don't know. I ended up just really not feeling well. And then I decided I was going to be macrobiotic vegetarian, which deeply skewed, you're laughing, but which deeply, that's how I was always late for class. Because
I don't even know what that is, but go ahead.
Is eating with the seasons, eating lots of grains, basmati rice, all kinds of stuff. But my diet became very heavily skewed carbohydrates and a little bit of protein. I was eating fish. And
all of that is very typical of young women.
That's exactly what I was getting at. Yeah. And it just seemed that that's what my friends were doing. We were all kind of doing the same thing.
I mean, I did a lot of counseling with women athletic teams at U of I while I was there. And the impact people, the distance runners, the volleyball people, they all had a lot of injuries. And if you start looking into their diets, they're all trying to be weight conscious and figure conscious. And you find out for these athletes, they're not getting nearly enough protein. Mm. And when you sort of correct that, they find that their risk of having injuries and everything and their energy per day is just much better.
Mm-hmm. And if you were to design a protein protocol takeaway and say, okay, for younger individuals, this is the amount of protein that you should be eating, how would you design a diet for, let's take, maybe it's male, female, maybe it's age related. How would you begin to take us through a life cycle?
You're asking a question about the amounts of protein or the types of proteins or both?
You pick it. Yeah. Choose violence. Choose violence. Just kidding.
I think the 0.8 grams per kg based on 25-year-old males eating pure dairy food that are physically active, I think that's an extremely low number for most people. So I think that almost all the data shows that getting above 1.1 grams per kg is where everybody should be. So that's whatever, 40.45 grams per pound or something like that.
0.37 grams per pound is the 0.8.
Is 0.8. Yeah. So, some 1.1 seems to be a real threshold. If you look in the literature at studies, that every study that looks at protein below 1 and above 1.2 will show a difference. Okay.
Below 1 and up
if you look at 0.8, 0.9, and you look at 1.2, 1.5, you'll almost always find differences. So there seems to be kind of a line in there. So I would always start with trying to get people up to above 1.1, 1.2 is the minimum. And then, I would go I would look for how much physical activity they have. I would look for their calorie intake. I'd look for all those kinds of things. And we find that in general, even when we're talking with women in weight control, metabolically, we need to get them above 100 grams per day. If they go below that, they seem to lose any of the metabolic benefits that go with protein. And so, obviously women have different weights, body weights, and people will say, isn't it really? Well, it kind of is, but we've looked at it kind of isn't. We've looked at a lot of women from 120 pounds to 300, and we find the 100 gram range still has meaning. So if they drop down to 85, we lose the metabolic benefits.
And when you say metabolic benefits of protein, are we talking about decreased blood pressure? Are we talking about improvement in triglycerides? Is this only when carbohydrates are controlled? Could you lay out for us a few of the metabolic benefits of dietary protein?
And so all of the research I did was trading protein for carbohydrates. So to your point, it's basically substituting protein for carbohydrates on about a 1-to-1 basis. So we, bring up the protein, reduce the carbohydrates, and then we get exactly the benefits you were talking about. They're all the metabolic syndrome outcomes: reduced blood pressure, lower fasting blood glucose, reduced triglycerides, increased HDLs, all of the things that would go with metabolic syndrome or prediabetes.
Do you think it matters, again, if we reverse engineer this and we think about protein as these individual amino acids and we think about getting above 100 grams, are we talking about animal-based protein or are we talking about plant-based proteins?
That's a good question. I don't necessarily have a great answer for that. We know that the animal-based proteins will give you a bigger bang for your buck. So, as you bring them into the diet, 30 grams of protein from whey protein at a meal is very different than soy protein or wheat protein. So 100 grams, those diets were 65% animal protein. So if you think about that, in general, plant proteins are 20 to 30% less effective, less essential amino acids. You'd have to be 130, 135 to be equal.
What would you say about the argument? And then I definitely want to discuss these myths. What would you say about the argument that as long as you're getting enough protein, it doesn't matter where it comes from?
I think that's true. If you commit to having 50 grams of protein at a meal, it probably is perfectly fine coming from plant proteins. If you're looking to have a muscle benefit with 20 grams of protein, it better come from animal protein. You'll get no effects from the plant protein. So, I think that you can get high enough, so if you are eating 135 grams of protein per day and you want 75% of that to come from plant protein, you'll probably be fine, especially if you're physically active, resistance exercise. If you're only eating 55 grams of protein per day and 100% of it comes from plant protein, like most vegans, I guess all vegans, most vegetarians, then you're going to be amino acid deficient.
You may have seen my family and I using red lights and infrared heating mats. Well, lately I have been using Bond Charge's small handheld device on the way to the gym because I'm out the door while it is still dark. And for me, I definitely need more than just caffeine to get me up and going in the morning. With using the small handheld device, it gives me personally a noticeable boost of energy before the gym. Bond Charge is a holistic wellness brand with a huge range of products to optimize your life in every way. It's founded on science and inspired by nature. What I love about Bond Charge is the products allow us to balance our highly industrialized lifestyle, which creates all kinds of dysfunction, from being under bright, unnatural lights to being inside all day. It is critical for overall health, and these products offer solutions. Besides, it's super easy to add in the red light panel, travel lights, clip on your computer, or the red light lamp. I use the lamps as soon as it gets dark outside and the larger panels 10 to 20 minutes each day, both near and red light. Bond Charge has the lowest EMF on the market and the quality, well, it's incredible. 12 months warranty on all red light therapy devices. Go to bondcharge.com/Dr. Lyon and use the code Dr. Lyon to save 15%. That's BONCHARGE.com/Dr. Lyon and use the coupon code Dr. Lyon. That's DRLYON to save 15%. I have two statements. I'm curious to how we determine amino acid deficiency. I don't know because most of the amino acids in the bloodstream or most of the amino acids are either circulating or in other various tissues. And it's something that has very much always been on my mind. How do we determine if someone has an individual amino acid deficiency outside of the obvious?
Related to what we said before, we don't know. It's just people aren't studying it in that way. We're trying to define something related to an RDA for essential amino acids, but we're using methods that I'm not really sure what they mean. The indicator amino acid oxidation method is a very elegant method developed by friends in Canada. I think it's a really cool method, but I frankly have no clue what it really means. and I've actually sent them a letter asking if they can tell me what it means. But the reality is we don't know how to really define essential amino acid deficiencies. There's some things done with like tryptophan deficiencies and some of those kinds of things. But
I think I've shown you some of the testing, and I think that this is where we have to become very careful as clinicians interpreting data. There are certain labs out there that will look at amino acids in the bloodstream, and people will say, oh, well, you can see here's your leucine, here's your methionine, and they'll look at all these different various amino acids, and whether something is high or low is not necessarily relevant in the bloodstream because, as you say, these numbers are very oftentimes, depending on what amino acid it is, very stable.
I have done thousands of amino acid blood samples for amino acids with all kinds of diets, high protein, low protein, different carbs, different fats. I've done it with different exercises. I've done it with weight loss. I've done it in all kinds of, and there is almost no way of looking at blood amino acids and making a prediction.
So
it certainly can't predict deficiency.
That is a very important point because
anyone who says you can is selling you a myth.
Please listen, friends, when you see someone who is getting amino acids in their bloodstream or in your bloodstream and giving you definitive recommendations based on this, please be wary. There are all different kinds of testing. Some are approved, some are not approved, but you're listening to one of the world leading experts in dietary protein, and it tells you very little. So I want to move on to some myths, and I want to pose statements that I hear in clinic where people will push back at me related to dietary protein. And one is this ethical consideration and this idea that I don't eat red meat or people don't eat red meat because they are concerned about factory farming. So I just want to have a mention of factory farming, regenerative agricultural practices. Are there hormones in meats? Are there hormones in dairy? Because if we can approach the conversation with leading with objections to people eating a well-balanced diet, we should do that.
Okay. Great.
That was a lot
of pieces. What was the first one you mentioned?
Factory farming.
Factory farming. I think that's a valid discussion. How would we like our food to be produced? People like to get food cheaply and food that they like the taste of. And what we know is that feedlot finishing cattle for beef produces a more tender and tasty type of food. But we now know that grass-fed animals have some quality to them in terms of essential fatty acids and things like that. So
quality in what way? Meaning
they have higher, essential fatty acids, EPA, DHA. Percentage-wise, it goes up a lot. It's like 300% more. From a quantity standpoint, it's really small.
Difference between 0.6 to 0.8, something very minuscule.
And, all of that gets into issues of land use and time and greenhouse gas and all kinds of things. To finish an animal in a feedlot, they'll come to market in 16 to 18 months, where if they're finished on grass, it takes 26 to 28 months. So they're just out there feeding and whatever for a lot longer time. Is that better? I think that's a debate that's important. Regenerative ag, how do we rotate animals? Is there such a thing as grazing an land? That's an interesting question. We need to rotate them, and I think ranchers and farmers are very sensitive to that.
What does that mean, rotating them?
So basically an animal, and I've spent a lot of time on ranches and farms. I grew up on a farm, so I have a knowledge of this. Basically, animals, cattle, goats, whatever, as they go on to a pasture, will eat the grass or forages or whatever. And how low do you let them eat it? How much, And so if you rotate them to another pasture, so if you've got a 400-acre area, is it better to let them be in all 400 acres, or do you put them in 100 acres and rotate it through? And we're learning that rotating it through is a better choice, both for the animals and for the land. And so that type of regenerative thing, I'm very sensitive to the issue of crop rotation. I grew up in an area where
Kewanee, by the way.
Kewanee, Illinois, just a little.
Do they have UFOs out there?
I'm sorry?
Do they have UFOs?
Yeah.
UFOs and drones?
I'm sure there's a lot of green men anyway. But anyway, I grew up in an area where we did a 5-year crop rotation. So the land would be in corn or soybeans or oats or something for 3 years, and then it would go through a pasture and livestock cycle. And so that allowed the grass to be there for carbon capturing. It allowed it to bring organic material back into the soil. It allowed the animals to fertilize it and to break up the soil. And so it was a very regenerative process. What we now have in Illinois, where I live, is now monocultures of nothing but corn and soybeans, high use of petroleum products, and we've had 50% of the topsoil lost to erosion in the last 50 years. So I think when people talk about sustainable food systems, ruminant animals and animals in general are very important a part of that regenerative agriculture. I mean, bottom line is people think about organic food. There would be no such thing as organic food without animals. It would all has to be petroleum products to grow the plants. And so organic foods under themselves rely on animal fertilizers.
Would you be opposed to eating conventional versus organic beef?
I'm not quite sure what organic beef means.
Okay, that's a great point. Because we get this question a lot.
That's not really a term, actually. So people may use it, but it doesn't really have any meaning.
Yes. So this is a really good point. When you go to the store, or we hear a lot of people, say, "Can I eat conventionally raised beef, or does the beef have to be, quote, organic?" Because you will go to the grocery and you will see, I can pull up some of the things that you'll see on the label, but do you care if it's...
I mean, grass-fed is definitely a label, and that has a meaning. I don't know that organic does. I'm not quite sure what that would mean. All animals are getting some supplements. They're getting some kinds of vitamin and mineral supplements. Even if they're grass-fed, they're getting things out there.
So here's what this says. It's interesting. So this is a certified organic beef. So there's, again, this is, Matt, we should go to the grocery and do a label breakdown. Certified organic beef. It has feed requirements, must be fed organic feed. Pastures must be free of synthetic pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizer. Feed, pastures, and supplements must be non-GMO. No synthetic hormones or antibiotics are allowed. Must provide access to outdoor and organic pasture. This looks like a lot of work. Can include finishing diet can include organic grains during the finishing phase. USDA certification must be certified at an accredited third party. Animal health and welfare, it says, includes guidelines for animal health and welfare.
I don't know how many farms out there, what amount of production can be done that way. Even the GMO and thing. I mean, the corn in the United States is all GMO. And if you have a small 40-acre plot next to 2,000 acres that are GMO, they're going to cross-pollinate. So I think all of that reaches very close to nonsense in my mind. The idea of some of the feeding practices I sort of get. Frankly, I think that is an enormous amount of expense for not much nutritional health outcome. But again, that's not something I've ever really researched. I would really like to see what those certifications are like and who's doing that.
Yeah, I think that that's something that we could explore, because it certainly is one of the questions. So basically, what I'm hearing you say is either or. You're fine. I personally like feedlot finish. That's what I grew up with.
again, I think the factory farming concept is something that ought to be looked at, and I think that is a government policy issue. One of the things we know in what has happened in agriculture is that dairy farms, for example, I'm going to make these numbers up. I don't remember them offhand, but if you look back 30 years ago, there was something like 450,000 dairy farms in the United States.
450,000, okay.
And now there's 75.
75,000.
So it's been an absolutely massive decline. And why has that happened? So now the average dairy farm all has 1,500 cows. And the reason for that has been government oversight, basically food safety, regulations, cleaning, how it all has to be handled. You have to have a veterinary on site, et cetera, et cetera. So it's basically driven all the small family farms out of business. So the government has basically forced the farm industry to consolidate. So they have forced the concept of factory farms versus the small family farm that I grew up on.
Wow.
And so that has happened in the beef industry. The processing plants in the United States now, my understanding is there's only about 5 for meat processing in the United States. When I grew up, there was one in every small town.
Guys, are you listening to this?
So it's basically government oversight has consolidated the industry. So when you think of industrial or commercial or that kind of agriculture, where you want to start the blame is with government. Government wants regulation. They want to drive the small family farm out of business because then they can regulate them. And that's fundamentally what's changing our food supply.
That is intense and scary because there was a time when everyone was on lockdown and, I think it was more difficult to get meat. Do you remember that?
Yeah, the largest pork processing plant in the United States is in, I think, North Dakota. I think it's Smithson, and it's owned by China. And so that was the first plant that was closed down. And you can believe what you want about where COVID came from, but it's interesting that plant came from China.
Wow. It's amazing.
China is now the largest owner of agricultural land in the United States of any foreign country.
What?
And most of it's being shipped out of the country.
I'm electing you to the FDA.
With a little luck, we'll be there.
Yes. With a little luck, we will be there. We are going to be doing a brand new segment. And you are the first person that we are doing this brand new segment. And it's a myth-busting segment. These are the burning questions that people have. Are you ready?
I love myths, yeah.
We are going to define first thing that we have to do. Again, this is section 2. And this is the myth-busting section, which is, again, what's burning people up inside. And I'm not talking about menopause. What does a high-protein diet actually mean? And we're going to do this because we have to clarify some of the myths. If we clarify the definition of a high-protein diet, would we say that typically refers to what? 1.6 grams per kg, 30% of total calories? Can you set the stage for a baseline?
The National Academy of Sciences says that the healthy protein range goes from 0.8 grams per kg to around 3. And so 1.6 is dead middle. So that I don't think 1.6 should ever be considered a high protein diet. I think it's a moderate protein diet.
1.6, okay.
I think 0.8 should be considered an extremely low protein diet. Might be healthy, but it's low. 1.6 is moderate. I think when you get up into the 2 range and higher, I think those are high.
Okay. So the myth, I'm going to read it to you here, and this came from something that was published in, I think it was the New York Times, and it was protein supplements are unnecessary or dangerous. You don't need protein powders or supplements if you eat a balanced diet. So basically it was a paper that came out saying exactly that they're unnecessary or even dangerous.
I think that you absolutely can get your protein needs from a healthy diet. 45% of the people by the USDA standards don't. And I think that we identified certain groups, particularly older women, who are particularly at risk. So I think protein powders and supplements are a great way to go. I try to keep my calories under fairly close check early in the day. So I use a protein powder shake for breakfast a lot.
Which you have been for like
30 years, 20 years or something.
At least since I've known you.
I mean, so it allows me to get 45 grams of protein with about 350 calories in a very convenient way. So I think the issue of, do people need them? Most people don't. Are a lot of people who can benefit from using protein powders? I think there are. Do athletes have the most expensive urine in the world? Absolutely. They're over-supplementing.
Are they dangerous? There is a lot of discussion about, I think I sent something to you recently about cadmium, high levels of toxins, depending, maybe lead, metals in these protein powders.
I think as we bring in all of these new proteins into protein powders and supplies, synthetic proteins, you mentioned other ones earlier. I think plant proteins, when they're being isolated, you have to question how they're being isolated and where they're coming from. So I think that the lead and cadmium in plant-based protein powders is something to be concerned with. I don't think there's really no reason they should be in dairy products like whey protein isolates or things like that. But I think the risk of them being in pea protein or hemp protein or something like that is real. And most of those products where whey protein isolate is 97% pure, a lot of the plant-based proteins are only 70% pure. So what's that other 30%?
What is it?
A lot of it's fiber-based, and a lot of those heavy minerals are bound to the fibers.
Very interesting. Very interesting. And, there's a handful of papers that talk about the positive effects of actually whey protein. Supplement whey protein on blood lipid profiles, whey protein improving glycemic response, and also in women with PCOS. So whether
I think that one has to be real careful with that. Is just adding a whey protein on top of a bad diet going to make you healthy? No. But if you use whey protein to reduce your carbohydrate intake, all of the things you just mentioned will get better.
Do you think that there are other additional benefits of whey protein like immunoglobulin, lactalbumin, lactoferrin, anything that may have certain benefits?
I mean, you certainly mentioned a few of them. Lactoferrin, because of its immune properties, and alpha-lactalbumin is like, in breast milk, it's like 60% of the breast milk in the first few days.
Is lactoferrin?
No, alpha-lactalbumin.
Alpha-lactalbumin. So
lactoferrin is very high in immune response capabilities. So the very purest of the whey proteins all go into expensive infant formulas.
Thank you to OneSkin for sponsoring this episode. I bring sponsors of products that I love and use on my own first. I became obsessed with OneSkin because one of my girlfriend's skin had completely transformed. I asked her what the heck she was using, and it was OneSkin. Now, I've always had issues with the texture under my eyes, and I've tried a million different products. I landed on OneSkin, and it's really helped me personally transform my skin. I have been using their Face Broad Spectrum sunscreen, eye cream, topical body supplement. I am just like bathed in this stuff. It has a unique clinically studied peptide that helps with DNA repair, and you can get 15% off OneSkin with the code Dr. Lyon. That's ONESKIN.com and get 15% off OneSkin.
Did a lot of consulting with a company known as Agripure, and they have probably the best whey protein on the market, and they also isolate alpha-lactalbumin. 100% of it is sold to very expensive infant formulas.
Maybe we should all reconsider our shakes in the morning to infant formulas. But it is fascinating, but that's not part of the myth busting. So I'm going to stay on track with my next question. Myth number 2, plant-based proteins are just as effective as animal proteins. And I'm reading this. All proteins are created equal, and plant-based options are identical to animal-based ones for muscle growth.
Yeah, that's 100% false. I mean, we know that.
How do you really feel?
Yeah, I mean, we know that all the plant-based proteins have lower essential amino acid content than essentially all of the animal-based proteins. And we know that the essential amino acids are the key. So can plant-based proteins be equal? Well, only if you eat more of them. So if a plant-based protein has 7.8% leucine in it, and whey protein has 12%. If you eat enough of that plant protein, you can get to that same level of leucine. So, you can get to it, but it will always take more total protein and more total calories.
And this is really where I think you're really going to make your next contribution. And I'm just going to read the title of this paper. We can link it. We are going to be doing a new show notes. So we're offering protocols at the end of the episode. You guys can go and sign up online. It's totally free. And we're going to put together our the journals that we're using so that people can read it. And this paper is Metabolic Evaluation of the Dietary Guidelines, Ounce Equivalents of Protein Food Sources in Young Adults, a randomized controlled trial. This was by your friend Robert Wolf, and basically the conclusion was that the ounce equivalents of protein food sources as expressed in the dietary guidelines are not metabolically equivalent in young healthy individuals, and that the magnitude of anabolic response to dietary proteins should be considered as the dietary guidelines develop approaches to establish healthy eating patterns.
Yeah, we in fact I just saw the proofs of a paper that's being published in the Journal of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, the Dietetics Lead Journal, on those ounce equivalents, because those are sort of fundamentally ingrained in the dietary guidelines as food substitutions. How do we substitute peanut butter for chicken breast? And basically...
2 tablespoons? Kidding.
Yeah. Basically, the ounce equivalent is that 1 ounce of chicken breast is considered to be equivalent to a 1/4 teaspoon of peanut butter. And they're remotely similar in calories, but the peanut butter has 1/3 the amount of protein and 1/4 the amount of essential amino acids. So they're not equivalent at all. So, as Bob Wolf has shown, from a muscle protein synthesis standpoint, these ounce equivalents aren't equivalent, which is even beyond the protein number. They're not equivalent in protein. And then if you look at the quality, the proteins aren't equivalent either. So, both in amino acids and bioavailability, most plant proteins from a digestion standpoint are about 75% down to less than 50% bioavailable. So wheat protein, for example, if it says there's 4 grams of protein in wheat cereal in your cereal box, only half of that's available to you.
Another really important point, myth number 3. High protein diets have a negative impact on kidney function. Is that a myth or a fact?
It's totally a myth. So let's start with, where did that myth come from? Well, the myth comes from that people who have kidney failure, renal failure, at some point have to reduce the solute load that the kidney sees. And whether that's salts or nitrogen or whatever the kidney is filtering, it has to reduce it. So people have gone to low-protein diets, but only shortly, because then they have to go to transfusions, and basically that requires high-protein diets. So that's where it comes from, is really diabetes and kidney failure. We've done a lot of looking at renal function on different protein diets. And what we know from animal studies, but translates to human, is that the kidney size and its efficiency relates to the amount of protein you eat. So if you eat
kidney size and efficiency, okay?
So if you eat a higher protein diet, you will have a somewhat higher kidney, and that gives you a higher capacity.
Heavier kidney?
I'm sorry, a larger kidney.
A larger kidney.
Sorry,
okay.
A larger kidney, and that gives you a higher filtration capacity. So your GRF, the glomerular filtration capacity, will go up. And what we know then from protein restrictions is it shrinks. And so one of the things that would happen, even in kidney failure, is as you reduce the protein, the kidney becomes less efficient. It gets smaller. So what we know is with higher protein diets is if you look at urea in the blood after a high protein meal versus a low protein meal, you will actually reduce the urea back down to normal after the higher protein meal quicker than the low protein meal because the GRF is higher.
That's interesting.
You actually become more efficient. So not only is the kidney, is protein not damaging, it's actually very healthy for making the kidney more efficient.
And would one see an increase in blood urea nitrogen if they were eating a high protein diet and then they take their blood?
If you look right after a meal, say, for example, you're used to a low protein diet and you take a high protein meal, you'll see a rise. If you look at it and people who are adapted to it, it should be a very marginal change. There will be a slight increase as that higher protein. I mean, when people eat protein, about 50% of it is converted to a waste product almost immediately. So there is a nitrogen accumulation that occurs transiently right after a meal.
Mm.
And that gets cleared very quickly.
And is that waste product urea?
Yes.
Okay. The next myth, and wait, before I go to the next myth, if someone is eating a higher protein diet and they're getting a larger kidney, depending, would the same also be true for the liver?
It tends to go up. I forget the exact amount, but it's a massive amount. It's almost like 50% of the enzyme in the liver are urea cycle. So they're part of that protein breakdown. So as you eat a higher protein diet, you will have somewhat larger liver.
And that is not a negative.
No, it's not a negative. It just is part of the metabolism. But interestingly, it's something to keep in mind when you see studies of short-term nitrogen balance in humans, is that if you take someone from a low protein diet to a higher, they'll show a net nitrogen balance for a short period of time because the liver and the kidney and the GI tract are all getting a little larger. And so people will interpret that as positive nitrogen balance and think it's muscle, but in fact it's organ systems adapting.
Crazy.
It's one of the things to always be concerned about when you see things that are
mass.
whole body measures of protein synthesis.
Yes.
You need to recognize that what they're probably reflecting is liver and kidney and gut metabolism more than muscle. And a lot of exercise people don't realize that. They'll look at that and they'll think, oh, that's a great thing on lean body mass. Well, it's technically lean body mass, but it's not muscle.
That is a very important point. So guys, when you're looking at some of the literature, you'll see either skeletal muscle mass directly, not often. And again, typically it's an extrapolated number unless they're using MRI or CT, or a D3 creatine, which is used sometimes. But you will see changes in lean body mass. And oftentimes the lean body mass changes are not skeletal muscle, because lean body mass includes organs and skeletal muscle and everything else other than bone and fat.
Yeah. And one of the things to keep in mind is you'll often see those whole body protein synthesis in studies where they want to look at breakdown. There's no way to look at breakdown in muscle, but if you do it in a whole body, you can actually get an estimate of breakdown by blood dilution techniques. But again, it's whole body. And that's why you tend to see those whole body measurements, because they can estimate breakdown. But again, it has probably nothing to do with muscle.
Next myth, high protein diets are harmful to the heart. High protein diets increase heart disease risk.
That's a total fallacy. That's probably some extrapolation from the epidemiology of red meat, but the relationship of protein to it is a total myth.
Protein timing. You need to eat protein immediately after a workout.
I'm guilty of being the source of that myth. So let me tell you where it came from. We were trying to determine why leucine was important. And one of the issues is when you look at protein regulation, it's regulated at a lot of different levels. It's regulated at the gene level. It's regulated at the point of protein synthesis. So it's referred to as transcription and translation. And we wanted to prove that it was, if you do starvation, if you starve for 2-3 days, you will downregulate the amount of mRNAs, your capacity for synthesis. But if you look at meal to meal, those are translational changes. We're regulating it minute to minute. So we wanted to have some way we could downregulate protein synthesis dramatically and then prove that it was leucine for recovery. And so we found that acute exercise would do that. So we basically did endurance running. We would decrease protein synthesis by 30 to 40%, and we could show that by giving just leucine, we could recover it instantaneously. So that's why we did it. As we were doing that, we did some timing, and we showed that protein synthesis would be down until we gave the leucine. So hence the idea that recovery after exercise was important. What we now know in a human sense is that it really only works in an untrained sense.
Which is important because there's a lot of data that comes out that shows protein timing and these massive effects, but it's
all untrained. It's exhausted exercise in untrained individuals. And that is really the only place it's ever been shown to be useful. So if you're...
What about older individuals or the elderly?
After exercise?
Yeah.
I am not sure I can quote a specific study of purely right after exercise. We know that it will work, but is the timing important is not. I don't know that anybody's shown that. Stu Phillips has shown some data that, whether you give the meal, right afterwards or whether you just accumulate meals over the next 24 hours, basically it doesn't make any difference. And that's how I think about it. If you're trained to do an activity, you're trained for an activity, I don't think there's any merit to walking out of the gym with a protein supplement. I think if your next meal's 2 hours later, it's perfectly fine.
High protein diet impacts bone mineral density, meaning high protein diets negatively affect the bone.
And what we now know is that high protein intake actually positively affects the bone. The origins of what you're asking is that what people saw early was that higher protein intakes caused higher increases in urinary calcium. And they started trying to look at bone chemistry and parathyroid hormone and things like that. And they sort of said, well, higher protein causes more calcium loss. But what researchers found, Jane Kerstetter and others found, was that what higher protein actually does is increase absorption of calcium. So you go from less than 20% absorption of dietary calcium to something around 40, so you double it. So that means the body's actually seeing a lot more calcium, and it can't use it all, so it ends up being in the urine. So it's really an absorption issue versus a loss issue. What we know from a lot of the fracture data, Bob Heaney and I have done some of this, is that what we know is that from hip fractures and all of that, your recovery is far faster on higher protein diets. And it's important to recognize that bone is first and foremost a protein matrix that is laid down first, and then we deposit minerals on it. Idea that you can give calcium supplements and that's going to give you more bone health, totally fictitious.
Really?
The first two elements of bone recovery are resistance exercise and protein. Calcium, whether it's 400 milligrams per day or 800 milligrams per day, isn't going to make much difference.
Does the body prioritize?
I've just sort of finished that thought. The U.S. has the highest calcium intake in the world, basically, and we have the most osteoporosis. It's not a calcium issue.
I did not know that.
It's an exercise and protein issue.
I did not know that. That's because, as a geriatrician, we are trained to, obviously, we give them protein, have them do resistance training, and then it is still recommended calcium, vitamin D, K2.
Sure. And I don't disagree with doing it, but it's by far the least important of those three legs of the treatment.
Very, very interesting. This is just a question, not necessarily a myth. When the body is in a lower protein state, is there preferential use for organs are first, right? And then if it were bone and muscle, do you think that there is a preference?
I would say that muscle is because of survival characteristics of mobility. Bone is much slower turning over. If you try to look at bone building, osteoclast versus muscle building, you'll find that it's a much slower process. So I don't think I've ever been asked that question, but I would lean toward the muscle.
The other major myth, we're already down to the 8th myth. This should probably be number 1. I cringe when I'm going to read this. The body can only utilize 20 to 30 grams of protein at a time.
Once again, I'm
hurts
guilty.
My heart right now.
I'm guilty for part of that because as we studied leucine, what we realized was that the minimum leucine amount to really be effective in an adult was around 2.5 grams. And in the meals that we were feeding, which were 60% animal, 40% plant protein, that's about 8% leucine. So that translates to about 30 grams of protein. So the 30 grams came from us, 30 to 35 grams. The body will use basically, it'll digest, absorb, and metabolize whatever level of protein you use, whether that's 20 grams or 100 grams. The efficiency will go down. I believe that you probably kind of max the efficiency per meal somewhere in the 50 gram range. So sort of, if I was a farmer doing least cost production, what I would say I would get the most growth for the least cost with about 30 grams. But if I'm a bodybuilder looking for the maximum effect, I would say 50, 55, 60 grams at a meal is perfectly great.
There is a trending question now.
Okay.
What role does protein play in cancer prevention and management? How does maintaining muscle mass help cancer patients with outcomes? So this is not a myth. This just apparently is a trending question.
Yeah. So I think the cancer and protein is an interesting question. Again, we don't necessarily have all of the data on that. There's some interest in things like glutamine and cancer cell activity. But one of the things we do know is that if you're unfortunate enough to encounter cancer, your survivability of the treatment and recovery directly relates to your muscle mass. And so protection of your muscle mass, how much muscle you go into it with, your resistance exercise, your protein intake, and how you do that during the treatment directly relates to your potential to survive it. So I think protein and exercise are incredibly important to the treatment phase. Individual cancers and sensitivity to amino acids, I think, is something that we are just barely scratching the surface of.
Eating too much protein turns into glucose. True or false?
Protein definitely turns in the amino acids. About 70% of them are going to turn into glucose. Some of them are what are called ketogenic. The branched chains in particular are metabolized as fats, but all the rest of them are converted with different efficiencies into glucose.
And while I think we should just booknote that and say that's not necessarily a bad thing.
No, I think that the fact that they are processed is part of the metabolism. It's why that low carbohydrates, it's why we fundamentally don't have a carbohydrate requirement at all. The body can make all it needs from the protein. And one of the beauties of that is when it makes it from protein, it's a very slow, steady process. So if you're on a high carbohydrate diet, during the nighttime, you have to rely on liver glycogen, and you wake up with very low blood sugar and tends to be hungry and sort of problematic. Where if you're on a higher protein, low carb diet, you make glucose the same whether it's the middle of the day or the middle of the night, and so you will wake up with a higher blood sugar and you feel better. You're less hungry.
And this is not a myth, but I do think it's important to mention is what we have both seen in our work is that those individuals on a high protein diet, and again, we're saying high protein, a moderate protein diet, 1.6 grams per kg, those individuals seem to run a higher blood glucose and or a higher hemoglobin A1C.
Yeah. So they will run a higher fasting blood glucose. Daytime, they don't see the spikes after meal. A lot of people believe that the real risk of high blood glucose is the post-meal excursions, that really high blood glucose is what causes the fine membrane damage. And so one of the things that actually I think is interesting that we don't know yet is, does A1C mean the same on a high carb diet as it does on a low carb diet? I think that the fact that blood sugar stays higher all night long on a higher protein diet, I think that may weight the A1C some, so I think, somebody on a higher protein, low carb diet might very well run a 5.7 or something, 5.8, which I think is totally normal for that kind of diet.
It's important to point out, again, in our clinic, we see that all the time, 5.7, all the time. And insulin is low, triglycerides are well managed. All other biomarkers look fantastic that are in optimal range. So,
I mean, we saw in animal studies, if you look around the clock, you'll see that the blood glucose stays much more stable. Muscle glycogen stays just as stable. It's down maybe a few percentage from a high carb diet, but it just never changes. And so it's just the body is adapting to a different way of managing glucose. But when it does that, it also has a different way of managing insulin, which is a very inflammatory sort of hormone when it's in excess. So I think it's one of the reasons why people who are treating type 2 diabetes or metabolic syndrome see such great benefits of a lower carb, higher protein diet.
Well said. Well said. Protein stresses the liver. Have you heard that?
Not really. I hear it about the kidney, but not necessarily about the liver. There's no question that the liver is the site of amino acid metabolism. And so does a increased protein diet mean the liver is higher function? The urea cycle has more of it. There's more enzyme. True. That would be like saying that exercise stresses the heart. Of course it does. It means it has to adapt to it. Is that a negative? No, exercise doesn't hurt the heart, and protein doesn't hurt the liver.
I do hear this, and I will say with protein stressing the liver, there hasn't been evidence that higher protein diets above 1.6 impair liver function in healthy individuals. What I've seen is this is the Global Liver Institute highlights that protein is essential for liver function and repair, and various things of that nature. So that's a good myth to clear up.
I mean, people, athletes consuming higher protein diet don't have, liver enzymes in the blood. They're not, showing, atrophying liver.
Yeah. I will say that individuals who train a strenuous training session, we might see a bump or elevation in liver enzymes, but it's not pathological, which leads me...
Yeah, it's not the protein issue. Right. It's the stress of the exercise.
It's the stress of the exercise. Which leads me to my last myth. We haven't talked about this. I know. Well, listen, we got to clear this up. Walking daily for 30 minutes is enough exercise.
Ooh, an exercise question.
Yeah.
I like to think of exercise in three buckets. One is body movement, which we know burns calories, but nothing else. Aerobic exercise, where you stimulate your heart, something above 100, depending on your age, 120, 140 if you're younger, which is aerobic, which gives you a cardiovascular benefit, increases the plumbing, strengthens the heart. And then there's resistance exercise, which actually causes stretch of the muscles and actually would cause hypertrophy of the muscles. I think all three are important, but I think people can make choices as to what's most important to them. And I still like the answer of, what's the most important exercise? And the answer is the one you'll do. So I think doing something is better than nothing.
Fair. And we should hold people to a higher standard, because if we think about aging, we have to maintain those muscle fibers. You have to maintain type 2 muscle fibers. And walking, while great for movement, is not certainly going to be enough really to maintain those tissues.
The fact that 75% of Americans are considered sedentary is a major health risk, and you just can't be beyond it. And you and I talk a lot about protein, but as a muscle expert person, the most important thing you can do for muscle is exercise.
Yeah. And that's fair. That's fair. This was one of the hard conversations that I had with you very early on in my career. You always hear the statement that the body is made in the kitchen. And it makes you believe, or it makes one believe, that diet is more important for body composition than exercise. And again, it's not black or white, but based on the stimulus to the body, training and exercise is going to stimulate muscle, change body composition, and affect muscle more so than diet. Would you say that is fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that I wish people would appreciate is just how flexible the body is. The body's an amazing machine at being able to adapt to different diets. And I think that, we know that vegetarians can be healthy. We know that protein, high-end athletes can be healthy. We know that people in the middle can be healthy, but we know they all can be unhealthy if they make bad choices. There's a reason the dietary guidelines refers to the vegetarian diet model as the healthy vegetarian diet. There's a reason they call it the healthy Mediterranean diet, and the healthy is because they're models of those that aren't healthy. You can have a very unhealthy vegetarian diet. You can have a very unhealthy Mediterranean diet. In fact, the Mediterranean diet that's actually eaten in the Mediterranean has nearly twice the red meat that the average American consumes. And so they don't want to say that.
The average American consumes how much red meat? Is it 1.8 ounces or so?
I think it's about 1.7.
Okay.
Let me see if I get this right. I can't quote it. Ty Beale had a paper just a while back, and I can't remember the units, but the average intake in the United States was like 31, and I don't remember the units per something. And the average worldwide is 55. So we're way under the world average.
Well, Dr. Donald Layman, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's always just a pleasure, and I learned so much. I know that the audience will learn a ton. If you guys are interested in more of Dr. Donald Layman, you can peruse the many podcast episodes that we have done together. My book, in fact, Forever Strong, is dedicated to you.
Always fun to be here.
Thank you so much.